Hey folks, on this video we cover a bit more on heredity, including sex-linked traits and twin studies. So sex-linked traits are traits that are based on genes that are held in the sex chromosomes. You might be aware of the sex chromosomes X and Y. You have an X chromosome here in pink and a Y chromosome here in blue. You see the X chromosome's a lot bigger, a lot more genetic information on the X chromosome over here. And generally, we think of the sex chromosomes as being responsible for sex differences in terms of sexual reproduction, development, that you've certainly learned about. And we'll talk about sexual development and sexual differences based on genetics and environment and that sort of thing in later in the semester when I do the sex and gender chapter. You may be aware that genetic females, typically have two X chromosomes, and genetic males have X and Y. And this leads to sexual development differences. There are a number of psychological traits and other biological traits that um, also go along with differences on these chromosomes that aren't necessarily based on reproduction. And these are what we refer to as sex-linked traits. So if there are genes on these chromosomes that influence something psychological, that might be sex-linked. The general pattern for sex-linked traits is that the action is on the X chromosome. And so, because there's a lot more information here on the X chromosome. So oftentimes a gene or the alleles of a gene will exist on the X chromosome and not appear at all on the Y chromosome. And what generally will happen then is that if you have a dominant version of that trait, it's going to tend to show up in females, right? Because dominant traits are going to show up phenotypically if they appear in either of the pair. So if I have an X and an X, I will be much more likely to have at least one dominant version of the allele, and so I will show that trait. So females will tend to show dominant traits. And then it's the males that will show the recessive traits, and that's coming not from the Y chromosome that males have, it's coming from the X chromosome. Now, why are they showing the recessive trait? Well, because they only have one X chromosome, and if that X chromosome is recessive, there's no dominant allele to override it. And if it's and so then they'll be much more likely to then show that trait phenotypically because there is no dominant version to override. So breaking that down for one psychological trait that is a sex-linked trait, which is color vision deficiency. You may be aware, and you can ask around if you're not, that color vision deficiency is much more common in genetic males than genetic females. And this is because the color vision deficiency comes from a recessive allele on the X chromosome. Okay? And so males are getting this trait from the X chromosome. Let's break this down for um, an XY father and an XX mother, both of whom can see the full spectrum of color. Okay, so we've got a father with a dominant um, color vision allele and a mother who carries the recessive trait. Okay, but she can see in color because she has the dominant allele on the other X. Okay? Now, if they have four children and the genetic lottery comes up so that there are different combinations, um, the first child might be female, have two X chromosomes that are both dominant. She will see in color. This other female offspring would have a dominant and a recessive trait, getting the dominant from the father and the recessive from the mother. She would have no issue seeing the full spectrum of color either. Okay. This male offspring would receive a dominant X chromosome and no information at all from the Y. So the Y doesn't contribute at all. The dominant trait turns to a to color vision for this individual. But this one, number 4, is where we're going to see color vision deficiency because they only have one X chromosome, and the X chromosome has the recessive allele. So in this case, the male offspring would be colorblind. which typically doesn't mean that you can't see in color at all. It means that there's a certain band of wavelengths that are more difficult to differentiate. And we'll discover why that is when we cover vision later. So you can see here that it's males are more likely to have the recessive traits. Um, but it's not because it's coming from the Y chromosome. It's because it's coming from the X chromosome from the mother's side, which is why they say, if you want to figure out if you're going to go bald, you don't check your father or your father's father, you check your mother's father, right? Because she likely received a recessive trait that she's going to potentially pass down. Okay, so that's sex-linked traits. They work in a somewhat Mendelian way or in much more complicated ways. But you can see that if you've got sex differences in psychology, they may come from just differences that happen to be on the X and Y chromosomes, but don't have anything to do with sex, like color vision. Last topic on the heredity umbrella is twin studies. So, if we want to study heritability in terms of differences in genetics and then differences in psychology, we need to have some way to make comparisons, right? So, I need to compare differences in um, people's family, right? But I also need to think about their environment. And so, what twin studies do is allow us to assess the relative contribution of the environment and the genes. Now, keep in mind that genes are always going to be involved. Every individual is going to develop because of their genes. If you don't have any genes, you don't form any new cells, right? Um, so we don't necessarily want to know whether genes are contributing to psychology. They definitely do. What we want to know is whether genes contribute to differences in psychology. And so we need people who are similar in certain ways so that we can look for differences in other ways. Let's break this down. Twin studies are going to look at either fraternal twins who come from two different eggs, or identical twins who come from the same egg, right? What you would notice is that fraternal twins are going to have a different combination of chromosomes, and identical twins are going to have the same combination of chromosomes. So identical twins are going to be more genetically similar. What's nice about them is that they grow up in the same environment typically, right? So we have people who are similar in terms of their environment. The major difference between identical twins and fraternal twins is how genetically similar they are. And so if dizygotic twins, fraternal twins, are more different from one another, then that's probably due to genes, right? If they look different, whereas identical twins look the same, it's because the genes made them look more similar, right? Same thing for psychology, right? So if identical twins behave more similarly than dizygotic twins, then genes are probably responsible or contribute to that psychological behavior or trait. That's a general assumption here. So when you're looking at twin studies, oftentimes they'll compare dizygotic twins, more genetically different, and monozygotic twins, more genetically similar. The other thing that you can do, which is really fascinating, and they've done this in Minnesota, there's other studies in the Netherlands and other places where they've compared twins who were raised apart. So these are monozygotic twins typically, um, who were not raised in the same household. They were split up and adopted to different households. Right? And there's various reasons why this might happen. Maybe people weren't expecting to have twins. The person who was adopting the child wasn't able to take care of two children, so they adopted to separate families. Or maybe the adoption agency sometimes found an opportunity to adopt out more people, so they split the twins. But these people now have very similar genes, monozygotic twins, but they grew up in different places. And so if two people with similar genes get raised very differently and they end up similar to one another, that is strong evidence for heritability. right? So if they end up looking very similar, then it's probably because genes are contributing to what they look like, how tall they are, that sort of thing. And if they behave similarly, then it's probably because genes contribute to those behaviors, right? And so we can study this in terms of psychology, and we can look for correlations between monozygotic twins, this twin and that twin, in terms of their various psychological traits. So you can look for personality differences, IQ differences, psychological disorders, like whether they end up with depression or not, right? Even pain tolerance, all sorts of psychological traits. Um, and they come up with heritability estimates. So based on how genetically, how similar monozygotic twins are to each other relative to just random people, we can come up with an estimate of what percentage of that psychological trait seems to be related or heritable, right? Overall, the differences. Okay? Some and that ranges depending on these various traits from between 40 to 80%. Um, so the differences between people on certain traits may be predictable to a certain extent, right? Just by knowing who you are in terms of your genetic similarity with one another. Now, we've got to be careful here because heritability doesn't mean one gene. Remember, all of these traits, whether you have depression or not, pain tolerance, your personality factors, there's a bunch of personality factors, IQ, these are all going to be polygenic, based on many, many genes. Okay. So just because monozygotic twins are similar in terms of extroversion doesn't mean that they share an extroversion gene. That's not what that means. Okay. They just have more overall similarity than other people do. Okay? And we should also then keep in mind that heritability, these percentage estimates, are population level, right? So it doesn't mean, so what it means is that if we compare people and how different all people are very different from one another, right? Um, we find that people who are twins are much more similar than completely random people. But it doesn't mean that twins are identical in terms of psychology, right? They're more similar than the population. And it doesn't mean that you can predict something for any one individual person. Okay. So knowing the general heritability of, say, whether somebody of depression, right, doesn't mean that I can predict whether an individual person is going to get depression or not. Okay. Um, it just means that um, there is a contribution in the variability in the population. Okay. So we do have to be kind of careful about not being too prescriptive about these things. And so there's a lot of work to do in terms of heritability, in terms of being able to kind of predict whether somebody might be susceptible to a psychological disorder so that we can help early, that kinds of things. We know many traits are heritable. We know things like addiction and depression and schizophrenia are heritable, but we don't necessarily know which genes or which vast combination or network of genes are responsible. So, for example, at least as of 2016, we could explain maybe like 2% of IQ with specific genes and maybe 10% of academic performance. This has gone up, and we got more information based on gene expression, which we'll talk about later. But just because IQ is heritable in terms of we can predict it at a population level, doesn't mean that I can explain which genes are doing what in order to have a formula for any individual person. Okay, so people are working on these things, not necessarily for IQ, but for more important things like whether somebody might be susceptible to a disorder that we can help with, and things like that. So people are working on heritability like this. And twin studies are going to help us get there, and genome studies are helping as well. Okay. Next time we cover the nature and nurture issue.